So today I want to talk a little bit about how you can navigate the journey through designing a research study and through submitting it to the IRB and getting IRB review and approval. And before we move forward with talking about that, we need to look back a little bit at why we even have institutional review boards, or IRBs. So the person that you see here on this screen, the lady, is Nurse Rivers. Anyone ever heard of Nurse Rivers? No? Okay. She was a coordinator for a public health funded study that began in Alabama in 1932. And the study was carried out in schools and churches with the engagement of the community leaders. All the subjects in the study were males. The participants in the study were told simply that they had bad blood. They were not told that they had syphilis. They were not told how to prevent transmission of the disease. They were told that they could get free spinal taps. They were not told that the purpose of the spinal taps was to track the progression of the disease, not to treat them. They were not told about treatment. They were not told about treatment even with the advent of penicillin as the treatment of choice for syphilis. So one of the things that strikes me when I look at these pictures is all the opportunities that there were for communication. The study continued unbelievably for about 40 years until 1972, when a physician talked to the press and the study was stopped. Does anyone know which study this is? Exactly, the Tuskegee syphilis study. So that's kind of one reason why we have IRBs today. As a result of that, there was a national commission established, and this commission was charged with identifying ethical principles to guide research. And those 3 principles are still foundational today. They're written in the Belmont Report, and those 3 principles are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So I think the usual IRB talk is more from a regulatory point of view. Make sure you cross this T, dot this I. I want to do something a little bit different today, and I want to challenge you to think about, when you design your research study, the ethical framework within which you should design that study. And I think that when you think about it from that framework and design your study that way and write that in your application to the IRB, you're not only going to have a stronger, more ethical study, but you're also going to navigate the process better. Because the reason for all the rules is to make sure that these ethics are carried out in research. So let's start with the first one and think about that a little bit. Respect for persons. So within research, what that particularly means is that people have the right to make their own decision. Yes, I want to participate. No, I don't want to participate. And that if people don't have the ability to make their own decision, a child, someone who lacks decision-making capacity, that there are additional protections provided for them. So one of the ways we make sure people are respected in research and have full autonomy is that they need to have the ability to understand information about the study, and they need to be able to choose freely whether or not they want to participate. So just thinking about this, one of the things you want to do in your application to the IRB is to show that you're respecting people by giving them all the information they need to make an informed choice. If I were to come in here today and say, I'd like to do a survey, tell me what you'd want to know before you said, yes, I'll do that, or no, I won't do that. What kinds of things would you want to know about it?
What are you going to do with the information?
Exactly. What are you going to do with the information? Who's going to be able to see the information? You know, suppose I said, I'm going to do a survey about how you feel about your nursing professors. Would you want to know if your professors are going to be able to see what you say? Yes. Okay, what else would you want to know?
Will my name and personal information be kept confidential?
Will my name and personal information be kept confidential? Is it anonymous? Do I have to write my name on it? Are you going to ask so many questions that you can deduce who I am? You guys are busy. Would you want to know how long it's going to take? Would it make a difference if it was 5 minutes versus 2 hours for this survey? What else would you want to know before you made a choice?
happens if I change my mind?
What happens if I change my mind? Would you want to know what kind of questions I'm going to ask? Would it make a difference if I'm going to ask you how much TV you watched last week versus questions about sexual activity or illegal activities? Anything else you'd want to know? Yes?
My information's going to be sold.
If my information is going to be sold, who's going to have access to my stuff? Other things you'd want to know? How about,
adverse effects?
there you go. Are there going to be any problems? Am I going to have, or what are the risks of doing this? Or, and the flip side, am I going to get anything? Are there any potential benefits? Okay, so those are some things that you would want to know before you made a choice whether or not to participate in research. So I printed out our template for an informed consent, and I'm just going to kind of go over the headings. One of the things we didn't mention is purpose. Why are you doing this? That's one of the headings. Duration. How long is this going to take me? Procedures. What are you asking me to do? Possible risk. Possible benefits. If it's going to cost me anything. Is it voluntary? Contact for questions. And confidentiality. Who's going to have access to my information? So those are the headings on our informed consent template. And the reason behind them is so that it helps you put everything on an informed consent that would give people all the information they need so they can make a choice. Now I have to tell you, I was pretty dismayed in the last 3 weeks or so. We've gotten in 2 applications to the IRB, and on the question where it says attach your proposed informed consent, the submitter attached the template. So I have to wonder how much that submitter is really thinking about the informed consent process if they're just handing us a template as opposed to a document that tells all the information about their particular study. So one of the things I did was look back at the last 9 or so applications that we'd gotten to the IRB, and what I found is that on 7 of 9 of those, they had to be sent back to the submitter specifically because the informed consent didn't have the information that it needed. So not only is this an ethical issue of giving people all the information they need, it's also a very practical one that your application will be slowed down if your informed consent doesn't give people the information that they need. If the IRB says, well, there's information not here. Just yesterday, I looked at an application that came into the IRB, and in the application itself, on the question, what are the risks, it said there's a risk of possible fall and fatigue and muscle soreness. But when I looked at the informed consent, it said there's a risk of muscle soreness and fatigue. There was no mention in the consent about you might fall when you're doing these balance tests that are part of this research study. So, think about that. What are the risks of my study? What are the potential benefits? What would I want to know if I were participating? If they were asking my family member to participate, what would I want my family member to know? And think about that with the framework with when you write your informed consent. What would you want to know about this research before you made a choice? Second way to respect people in your IRB study is to give them the information they need in understandable language. And that means not only the language that they speak, but also language that's not too technical. Our guidance is to write the informed consent on basically a 7th grade level. And so you want to make sure that it's written in language that's understandable. So just last week, I got back an IRB review. This is something that IRB member said, quote, purpose in the informed consent is not clear for the average reader. Participants should know why research is being conducted. So here's what the informed consent actually said. To assess training load differences between the workload of different ability groups and the positive adaptations. Does anybody know what the purpose of this study is? Yeah, me neither. Now, it was actually a sports kind of study, and maybe it makes sense in that to those people who are experts. But to the average reader, you're probably going to read that purpose and think, I don't know why you're doing this study. So the IRB reviewer picked up on that and said, you need to really clearly say in your consent, we're doing this study because we want to learn, or whatever, so that it's clear to the person participating. So those are some ways to think about your study design and your IRB submission, making sure that you consider respecting people by providing them all the information they need and providing that information to them in a way that's understandable. Also, under respect for persons, we want to think about providing people adequate confidentiality and privacy. And these are also issues that the IRB looks at. So one of the ways you want to think when you write your study and design your study is, how can I protect people's confidentiality and how can I protect their privacy? Now, those are separated out for a reason, and that's because they are two different things. And this is another frequent area that causes delays in submissions to the IRB because of there not being sufficient clarity in the application about these two different areas. The best example I can give you is, as a nurse practitioner, when you have a patient's file, whether that's paper or electronic, and you make sure that it is not accessed by someone who's not authorized, that's protecting their confidentiality. Confidentiality is about people's data, their information. So you make sure that someone else in the waiting room doesn't see that file, or somebody walking by your electronic health record can't read the record about someone else. That's how you protect their confidentiality. But when you, as a nurse practitioner, enter a room, you talk to the patient, and you step out so that they can get ready for the exam. You make sure they're draped appropriately when you perform your exam. And when you're finished and through talking, you step outside the room and allow them to get dressed. That's how you're protecting their privacy as a person. So when you're thinking about your research study and designing it, think, how can I protect people's data and how can I protect their privacy? And then write that in your application to the IRB so that you're assuring protections for both of those. So my favorite response on an IRB application, the question is, how are you going to protect people's privacy? And the answer was, kept in locked file cabinets. So I can only hope they were talking about their information and not the actual people themselves. So suppose I were doing a survey 6 months from now, and I said, I want to do a survey about how you feel about the professors that you dislike. I want to know why you dislike them. So if you'd like to do that, raise your hand and I'll give you a consent. Would you think that scenario allowed you adequate privacy? No. Right. Okay. So think about that is when you're planning how you're going to recruit participants and how you're going to consent participants, how can you do that in a way that gives them privacy? One of the scenarios that comes up frequently for the IRB and also for you as students is trying to make sure that research environments offer you that privacy, and particularly create an environment that allows you to freely choose. So let me give you another scenario, and you tell me which one would give you the most ability to make a free choice. In a class setting, a setting similar to this, we pass out research surveys, and you can either fill it out or you can just sit there. Or an email is sent out with a link to the survey, and you can choose whether or not you want to delete the email, click the link, and take the survey. Which one of those setups do you think would afford you the most privacy? I'm sorry, what? Which one would give you the most privacy, do you think? The email. The email? Okay. All right. So there are lots of questions on IRB applications about how are you going to recruit people, how are you going to consent them, and those are the places where you can indicate how you've thought about and designed your study to provide for their privacy and an environment that gives them the ability to choose freely. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, with respect for persons, people who lack decision-making capacity or have impaired decision-making capacity have the right to additional protections. So my recommendation would be, if you want to do a research study that involves children or pregnant women or other participants that would be vulnerable, that you probably need to come talk to us at the IRB or to those of you at Asheville with the Asheville IRB so that you can think through those scenarios and work through them. For example, with children, there are additional rules about when you would need to seek the assent of the child. Are they old enough to assent and understand? What's the age when they should document their assent by signing something versus just telling you? Do you have to get permission from one parent, or do you have to get permission from both parents? So there are lots of things to think about in those scenarios. And so if you're doing that kind of research, I suggest that you talk to the IRB before you submit. All right, are there questions about the principle of respect for persons and how to think about that when you're designing a research study? All right, then we'll look at the next ethical principle, which is beneficence. And what this principle means is you just want to get the risk as low as you can get them, and you want to get the potential benefits as high as you can get them. So when you design your study, you want to design it so that you lower the risk of your study as much as possible. And in your application and in your consent, you want to make sure you're consistent about describing those risks and those benefits. So let's talk just a minute about risk. Suppose I'm going to do a study, and I'll say, as part of my study, I want you to cross the street. That's what people are going to do. They're going to cross the street. So what are the risks associated with crossing a street? You get run over. All right, so if you're going to cross the street, how can you minimize the risk? Crosswalk, good. Look both ways, exactly. So now if you're a researcher and you submit an application to the IRB and say, as part of my research, I'm going to have people cross the street, and you don't say anything else, and maybe in your mind you're thinking, and I'll do it at the crosswalk, and I'll look both ways, and I'll have them look both ways, but you don't write that, then the IRB is kind of stuck, because the IRB is supposed to be looking at that and saying, are the risks minimized? So you want to think about the risk of your individual study, and then think, how can I minimize those risks? And write that precisely in your IRB application. And that's a very important part of the IRB application, is lining out the risk, the potential benefits, and making sure you describe those clearly, and that you've minimized the risk as much as possible. Last, we'll look at the ethical principle of justice. And this is one that we pointed out in the Tuskegee study, how that this was a particularly vulnerable group that was exploited and they weren't going to get benefit from this research. So the principle of justice demands that we treat people fairly and that we design research so that its burdens and benefits are shared equitably. So bottom line, that means people have the right to be selected equitably. What does that mean for you as a researcher? You want to make sure you achieve justice in your research study by equitably selecting your population. So you'll find on IRB applications that you're asked questions about who are you going to include, who are you going to exclude, how are you going to recruit? And so you want to be very clear in your responses about why you're choosing a certain population, why you're excluding others from that population, and there can be some very valid reasons. But you want to be clear in your application as to why you chose the group that you chose, and make sure you select them fairly. So I guess this might be my second favorite response on an IRB application. The question was, describe how the selection of subjects is equitable in relation to the purpose of the research and the setting of the research. And the answer was, quote, I'm enrolling students because they're the easiest group to get to do research, end quotes. So now if you were an IRB member, would you think that that researcher designed his study with justice? Honesty, maybe. Right. So this is another principle that's very important to uphold as you design your research study and submit it to the IRB. So those are the three principles. Keep in mind when you're thinking about what you're going to do for a research study, and when you sit down to design your study and write your application to the IRB, make sure you do it within a framework of respect for people, beneficence, and justice. And how that plays out from a practical point of view is making sure that you write your consent document and design the entire process of consent so that people are given all the information they need, and they're given the information in a way that's understandable to them, that you make the risk of your study as low as you can make them, that you make the potential benefits as high as you can make them, and that you select people that will be potential participants in this research as fairly as you can do that. So if you do that within that framework, you're going to have a really strongly designed ethical study, and you're going to make the IRB process much smoother and more efficient because there'll be less back and forth of your application. So now from a practical point of view, I do want to say My son is obviously on his journey getting a lot closer to the school. Took a long time. One of the things you need to factor in is allow enough time for the IRB process. Your lives are stressful enough that you don't want to heap additional stress by thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to graduate, I'm not going to be able to get my IRB approval in time. So you want to be sure you allow enough time for that process. So to give you some idea of that time frame, we were first able to get benchmarks a couple years ago in 2009 and 2010, our first national benchmarks, and we found we were a little above them. So there are 3 levels of review at the IRB, and this first one is full review. That means the full committee has to look at it. It's more than minimal risk, and the whole committee is looking at it. And so we've worked hard to bring down our review times, and as you can see, ETSU now is right at 35 days, which is below the national benchmark. The next level of review is called expedited, and that level of review is a minimal risk study, and it means a couple members of the IRB look at it, not the whole board, but a couple members. And that time as well, though decreased, is still about a month. Now that's a mean, so you want to allow even more time than that because it may take longer than that. So my recommendation would be make sure you allow 6 weeks or so for a full or an expedited review in IRB review time. The last category is called exempt, and it's a very special category of very restricted types of research that meet some federal regulations that say it's exempt from a bunch of rules. And so that's actually a much faster process. It's really reviewed by the IRB to make sure it meets the exempt criteria as opposed to meeting all these other approval criteria. And so that's a couple weeks, 15 days. Exempt studies typically might be a survey or an interview that is either anonymous or, if it's not anonymous, contains no questions that are of concern. So if that's the type of research you're doing, I would also suggest you talk to the IRB. We can give you some directions about the exempt consent process because it's less burdensome, there's less requirements on that. So I'm not sure what types of research you guys will be doing in here, but that's one thing to keep in mind. Depending upon the type of research will impact your review time. It's the IRB that makes the decision about which category of research your study particularly fits, but you can certainly request a category on the initial application. Are there questions about review time for IRB? Okay. Well, then you might have the very practical question, well, how do I submit to the IRB? We do have an online system, which will be good for those of you who are that don't live here. And so you would need to get access to our online system. It's called IRB Manager. And I brought with me some forms, a request for login form, it's titled, and that's a form where you fill out your information and sign indicating that you recognize that when we give you an electronic password and you enter that password in this application, that it's the equivalent of a handwritten signature, for example, and that you won't release your password, you'll keep it confidential. So my son found out that his journey didn't look exactly like he thought, but he had a wonderful time and learned a lot. And when he got to his destination, he saw this incredibly beautiful school. And so that's the last slide in my show, this school. And I think it's fitting that it ends with a school because we're all here to learn. You guys are here to learn in a wonderful career. And researchers are trying to learn things, solve problems, figure out if this hypothesis is true. As for the IRB, we want to learn too. We want to learn how to better protect people. We want to learn how to facilitate ethical research. So we welcome your suggestions and your feedback along the way so that we can learn and improve as well.